The 2024 NBA draft is about 3 weeks away. We are getting there. And it's never a bad time to go back to some prospects that just frankly confuse the hell out of me and might have value that I have missed. Welcome to Chucking Darts, a podcast of informed, rigorous, reckless, harmless, speculative, and fun predictions about the game you love. And you can call me Chuck. I think this is technically episode number 204. My last episode, 203, was with Brian Schroeder at Brian JMBA. That was before the withdrawal deadline, and that was about an area that I thought the draft was actually sneakily kind of deep in power wings. But then Clifford goes back to school, Ty and Grant Foster goes back to school, Jameer Watkins go back to school, and that kind of thins out. But we talked about some other guys in there too that are still in the draft. Please go revisit that episode and follow those guys next year because they did the right thing for them and they're going to be awesome in college next year. I did a quick sprint episode by myself last night. That was a preview for the finals. If y'all are listening to me for NBA, and that's great. They tip tomorrow, but whenever you're listening to this, this one is going to be about Nikola Topic, Kel'el Ware, and Dillon Jones. Three prospects that have wild skills, wild extreme skills, but three prospects that for one reason or another, I personally have had trouble wrapping my head around. And so I wanted to bring in someone that I take a lot from every cycle. I'm not ashamed to admit that because his work is so good. It is Ben Pfeifer at BJPF on Twitter. He has a great YouTube channel that he has been doing great work on over the last year plus, including all throughout this cycle. And he is relatively high on all three of these gents. But before we get into that, Ben, how are you? Welcome back.
I'm doing well. Thanks for the words, pal. I always enjoy your stuff and always enjoy coming on here and the good conversations. But yeah, I'm doing well. We're getting there. I'm in my head moved on to the next two drafts anyways, as I kind of tend to be. But yeah, there's still plenty of things to happen in the next, I don't know, like 20 days. Is it June 25th or the 24th or 23rd? I don't remember.
Well, remember, it's 2 nights now, so
Ugh, I
it's
hate that. That sucks.
yeah.
I'm
uh
fortunate, I'm fortunate enough that I work hybrid from home, so I'm gonna be able to cover that live because that's also kind of my job, right? But
mhm.
why would you have a separate day for the second round if you're gonna put it at 1 p.m. Pacific? I
I
don't
agree that the time doesn't make any
timing is
sense.
weird.
That's a
Timing is
half measure, in my opinion.
weird.
It really seems like they want to test out if people will watch it, but you should at least give it a chance if you're going to do
Yeah,
that. When they announced it, I thought it was a nice idea because I like spotlighting the guys more who go in the second round, and
that's definitely true. I agree with that.
I think there also might be like a weird when you give teams a night between nights 1 and 2. I think you might see some weird like teams trying to target a specific player in the second round a little bit more. Now that is a theory, it's never been proven because
I'm
it's never been done
curious to
this
see
way.
what sort of NFL draft isms we get if
Right. That's sort of like I'm very interested in it if nothing else. But I agree that
same.
for
Yeah.
like the consumer experience, they should have just put it in prime time if they're going to do it. So
Yeah, I mean, it's the draft regardless. Sickos like us are going to be tapped in regardless. But
yeah, we're not the demo they're going after. We're
we are not their demo.
yeah.
I mean, I'll have as usual. I'll have the ESPN on my TV in the background muted while I just get my picks leaked on Twitter. It's
Right. The
oh,
modern entertainment, baby.
and because the Pacers don't have a pick, so I don't have to sweat any of that out.
Oh yeah, that's right. What a run for you this
Yeah,
playoffs,
dude,
man.
it was sick, honestly. Un Unfortunate ending with the fact that there was a world where the Pacers were up 3-1 pretty realistically against the
Yeah.
Celtics. But it is what it is. It was fun. I'm ready for next year.
Can I ask you, speaking of guys that have confused me in years past, were you a Nemhard guy in his draft year? Were you high on him?
I was a Nemhard guy. I've been a Nemhard guy since he was at Florida, honestly. I always loved his big guard passing skill set. And it's cool to see him kind of translate that to the league. So I mean, I wasn't I I don't think I would have had him top 20 or anything high, but I was pretty sold on him being um an NBA player, which seems like it happened. I had him actually lower than I thought. I had him yeah, at some point in the second round, but
Well,
I've always really enjoyed his game regardless.
big guards who pass is a nice little transition to what we got going today. But we'll start on sort of a bittersweet note with Nikola Topic, who is a presumptive, I think at worst top 7 pick before news
Yeah,
about his
seems like it.
ACL that is now partially torn. I guess I don't know what the prognosis is for a recovery. Have you heard anything of whether it's 6 months, a year? The word partially seems to suggest that he might be back sooner. Do you know anything about that?
I think I don't have any like intel, but I guess like the partial, but I don't know. It's hard not to see this as anything but a negative.
Right.
Honestly, it's a bummer, right? Because Topic obviously had his injury, and then he came back and like gave it a shot
Right.
in like May or um whenever that was, and he just didn't look right, and then he re-injured it. Um, so especially for a player whose success is as predicated on like burst and downhill athleticism as Topic, it's like that that just sucks. And like I don't really know how I'm gonna price that into my evaluation. In these cases, I'm generally just like I'm gonna treat it as if they're gonna turn out fine because I'm not a doctor.
Right.
Um, but yeah,
Right.
I don't know. From reading like the tea leaves and such, it doesn't seem great. Like he said, he wasn't like he's not running or practicing with the basketball. I'm like he's young and
I
injury
mean,
injury recovery is a lot better now, but still I'm like it's not.
and since the International Combine was this past, I guess, weekend, I mean, they're following a combine is a withdrawal date, and theoretically, he could still withdraw if he felt like his stock was just really going to tank. I doubt that's going to happen
Yeah,
in this draft class. I
wouldn't be
think he's
very
probably pretty
surprised.
stable. Right. But it adds some uncertainty to him. And he is someone who I have had, as I've watched him, like all over my lottery. I've had him as high as number 2. I've had him as low, again, not really pricing in the injury. I've had him as low as like 10 to 12, that range. And the reason that and I'm framing this as just a pure problem of mine, something that I'm trying to get better of as an evaluator, is I'm trying to visualize what kind of I guess, point guard, because he is a pure point, what kind of a point guard, what kind of a creator he is at the next level, and how his particular brand of scoring and creation will stack up against, the most blessed creator league in the world, where there's all these, really gifted on-ball scorers all over the place in the NBA. I'll kick it to you for just your general scouting report on Nikola, and then we'll get into a little bit the sort of nuances in his game that are giving me some trouble.
Yeah, I definitely lean on the higher side on Topic. I've felt this way throughout he's been pretty consistently up there for me throughout the whole cycle. And to me, it really does come down, like you said, to that creation. I think it's his very, very elite burst, his ability to get downhill in a straight line. And then when you combine that with his playmaking, which I think is good, not great, maybe a little overrated by some. I think his shooting, which is probably, I think, a little better than other people
I'd
might think.
agree on both counts. Yeah.
Um, Defense is a big work in progress. That's no doubt. But the fact that Topic was able to be a legit primary in a pro league and dominate basically, um, even in a way where like, I mean, I compare it to Durasic because obviously there's going to be that comparison. Durasic in his recent games, right? Like he had great stat lines, but it wasn't a total like takeover the way that Topic like controlled the game. And obviously Durasic is also older than Topic. Not about Durasic or anything, but yeah, I think Topic is just, I think if you're looking for a legit guard size or somewhat tall guard sized initiator, like there pretty much aren't better bets injury withholding than Topic because of his ability to generate paint touches at will and score at the rim. And I think while there's a lot of underdeveloped aspects of his scoring game, like the mid range, especially,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that he's so ridiculously good at getting downhill, it's like he probably hasn't really needed to score it in the mid range a ton in his life. And I think that's a problem a lot of young, explosive downhill athletes have. And I think it's a worthwhile bet on Topic's youth and tools, and hope that he can improve that, because I think there's enough flashes to where it's like I could totally see it happening.
Yeah, and so a couple things that you mentioned there to build off of is he was in that Adriatic League. He clearly the best player on his team, would dictate and control whole games as the point of attack, the point guard. When Red Star called him up to the Euro League, second best league in the world, they started out with him as their starting point guard. They brought him up to fulfill not a similar like monster usage role, but a similar role in that he was controlling large aspects of the offense when he was in the game. They then moved him to the bench. He got his injury. He came back and he was coming off the bench. We've talked about that. He wasn't really the same player when he came back.
Yeah,
But his
I don't hold it against him.
no, 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 nor do I.
Yeah.
But his ability, you mentioned get downhill in the straight line. His burst is quite good. Like I certainly agree about that. What sticks out to me most is like the tightness of his handle because he's not like I don't think his handle is terribly creative where he's, like Dillingham constantly trying to break ankles and break people down.
Yeah.
He's sort of like a spammer to me, where he knows where his advantages are and he knows how to get to them and he's going to go to them over and over and over and over again. And that leads, like you said, to an underdeveloped mid-range game because he's never really had to do it. He's also basically a below the rim athlete, in at game speed. And that means that his rim attacks usually come in two varieties. One is it's a race to the hoop, and if he gets there first, he's finishing. The other is he will have like one pretty hard deceleration step and like bump a little bit and then try to do like basically a layup, like an easy floater off glass. And it did work for him in that Adriatic League. And in the Euro League, you saw it in little bits and pieces, but against older, better athletes in that league, you can sort of see how they could contain his drives a little bit more, and those two solutions were not quite as effective. Now, he's one of the youngest guys in the draft. It turns 19, I believe, in August. And so I don't really hold that against him in his ultimate eval
Yeah.
either. But what I
It's a
am
data
interested,
point, but it's not like a be
right?
all or anything.
What I am interested in, though, is where you think his offense can go. For someone who is built to compare him to another really good downhill athlete who's not really the playmaker is it Topic? I have Topic in my head.
I think it's Topic.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'll say Topic.
I think so.
To
Topic,
compare him
Topic.
to another downhill athlete in the league who has not quite come into his own yet, doesn't quite have the playmaking that Topic has, but is probably even a better downhill athlete, is like Jaden Ivey,
I figured
someone
that's what you
who
would say.
did not have much of a mid-range game at Purdue, never really needed one. More of an above the rim athlete than Topic is, and not a great context in Detroit. But he I think has consciously tried to do more work in the mid-range and vary how he decelerates and try to up his playmaking. Like he's really tried to work on his weaknesses. And I think Jaden still might have some sort of breakout ahead of him, but it's
I think,
been
yeah.
difficult. It's been difficult. So how difficult do you think it would be for Topic to turn these underdeveloped areas into like ones of real strength to where he can reach maybe a top 2 offensive option level on an NBA team?
I think it's fairly realistic, assuming that the health stuff holds up. I would say my number one main weakness offensively for him is that lack of vertical pop. And I think it neuters some of like what is really special, which is like his finishing touch.
Mhm.
I think I generally lean optimistic and think, while there's going to be some issues with translation, right? Just because of the uptick in athleticism at the league. I think he's one, like his first step is in driving is good enough and his touch is good enough at the rim. And I think that touch at the rim has me optimistic that he can move it back out. Just a little bit, because there were some flashes of him like snaking pick and rolls into floaters, playing a little slower. Again, they were flashes because he didn't really need to do it very often.
Mhm.
It wasn't there's no reason to slow play into a mid range when you can get a layup every play. But Topic is a truly absurd touch guy who I feel like doesn't really get that rep because he doesn't take floaters just because he doesn't need to. Topic shot, I believe, I'll pull it up right now. I know it was around 67% on half court layups this year, which is an
It's real
absurd
good,
number.
real
It
good.
is
Yeah.
absurd. Just for some comparison, I mentioned this in like a Topic article I wrote recently.
Yeah, it's for Sports Keto, correct? Is that who
Yes, that is
published
correct.
that? There you go. Yeah.
Luca was at 62% of his half court layups his last year at Madrid. Steph was at 61%. Shea was at 55%, and Ja was at 51%. Just to name a couple of the great touch guys. And I clicked through a ton of synergy profiles, and the only prospect I could find with a higher half court layup percentage was Kyrie. So like, um, which is is what it
Yeah.
is, right? That shouldn't be
Also,
surprising.
also not a vertical pop guy, Kyrie.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to compare him to Kyrie because that would be sacrilegious, and I don't think they're very similar. But I think in the way that obviously Kyrie's like crazy, crafty, balanced, hanging air, all of that shit. I'm not saying it's fair to expect Topic to reach even close to those heights, but I do think it's a good like players can succeed below the rim. I think Kobe White is another kind of example this year who
Hmm.
doesn't isn't a super above the rim athlete, but gets downhill a ton, has a really nice touch, can kind of hang in the air. And I kind of see those as like acolytes for Topic in some kind of ways. And I think it's that to me having this elite downhill threat like makes it easier to develop other skills, right? Because you have this thing that is always going to work and is always going to be devastating to defenses, and they're going to be playing to take it away ideally.
Hmm.
And that it's like, okay, yeah, you're giving me space to practice my mid ranges. Like, sure, I'll practice these. Um, I do have some worries about Topic's handle. Like you said, I do agree. Like it works for what he does, like his straight line drives, but I think his like east west shake is not that great. Um, just like not super dynamic or creative or flexible in that way. And I think like that really showed up in the post-injury tape when he couldn't win with burst and he was trying to like beat bigs off the dribble east west, just could not do it.
Hmm.
And Topic is normally a guy who like a big will sag off 5 feet and he'll still get a wide open layup. Like that's how fast he normally is. So I think that's going to be an improvement area, but I definitely have confidence that Topic can progress in these ways. I think of Fox as another guy who was like very underdeveloped as an intermediate scorer, but had great touch and could get to the rim whenever the hell he wanted. Um, I think there's enough examples of these guys improving. And like I said before, I think the shot, while not like amazing, is far from broken. Like
Well, yeah, and let's be clear. I mean, in terms of international pro league play, which, this year he had 23 total games between Adriatic and EuroLeague, it looks like. And then last year, geez, I'm seeing 37 games. I don't have quite the league breakdown, but healthy free throw numbers both years. We're
yeah,
looking at
yeah,
60 games now, and he's basically 88% from the line to
that's
echo
pretty
another sort of
that's pretty
Kyrie. Just
legit. I mean, free
extremely.
throws free throws stabilize a lot more quickly than threes. And like that's pretty legit, man. And I will say, like, he also was a really like nice low volume off dribble shooter. I don't remember exactly the volume, but I know he shot like a ridiculously good number from three off the dribble. And I think he's like, I liked that. I think as the season went on, at least before his injury, he got more comfortable taking the pull up when defenses go under, which is going to be a really important shot for him, as it is for like Collier and even Dillon Jones and like so many of these like shooting questionable guards. Can you punish or can you force him to play a different coverage? And if the answer is yes, he's probably going to be ridiculously good. Um,
Yeah, I'm
yeah,
not. Yeah, the off the dribble three stuff, I'm not particularly worried about that. I mean, there's a draft draft people have dissected and over dissected and redissected the relationship between free throws and threes and when it stabilizes. But at some point, like if you are 88%, like there's just some level where I'm just like, this is going to be fine. And
yeah,
he doesn't, yeah, high 80s, and he's not afraid to get them up.
yeah,
So I
yeah,
think he's going to be just
exactly.
fine.
My read on free throw percentage, I think it's people tend to overvalue it, but if you're really, really good or really, really bad, that probably means something.
Right, right.
And Topic in this case is like really, really good. But like I wouldn't really think much of someone if he was like 67 to like 80, 79%. I'm like, yeah, whatever. But I'm like 88 over that sample is really, really good. And I think it tracks with his touch on tape, right? As those are all touch indicators. And Topic has absurd touch when you actually watch his finishes. So I think that tracks. And part of my optimism for Topic is like, even if the intermediate game stuff doesn't come along super well, I think there's a good chance he develops into a pretty solid pull-up shooter regardless. And I think that plus the rim stuff could carry him to a pretty decent outcome, even if it's not like his absolute highest possible ceiling.
Well, and if we're in sort of optimistic waters, I think one way that that might manifest itself is a lot of the skill development for someone like this might happen out of necessity. He hasn't needed to explore the
Yeah.
mid-range yet. He hasn't needed to lean much on his pull-up threes yet. But if we know the skill is in there, or we feel good about his touch indicators or whatever, and in the NBA, that downhill burst isn't solving things as frequently and as emphatically as it is now,
And it
then
won't.
he
No.
builds out the rest of his game more organically, more quickly. And so that could be an optimistic path for him to getting to a high-end outcome, so to speak. But I wanted to go back to Fox, because Fox, as great as he is now, and he's like borderline all NBA every year now, well, there's an argument that he really needed a change in roster construction to like vacate the paint for him frequently with Sabonis to like actualize and become who he is. So do you think that there is a particular roster construction? Obviously, a vacated paint with a five who can shoot is always better than not for a point
Sure.
guard.
Yeah. That's like
But do
that.
you think that there's a
Yeah, sure.
roster
I want a
construction?
spacing five who's great at screening. It's like,
Yeah, well, yeah. Or I'll play with Victor Wembanyama. I'm very optimistic about how I'm
yeah,
gonna, yeah.
sure.
But
Um,
like comparing, if you have Ivy on one end and his contacts in Detroit, and Fox on another end and his contacts in Sacramento, like how context proof do you think Topic is? And what is he gonna need? Like in terms of where he might go, we'll put obviously San Antonio to the side. That'd be great for him.
that would
But
be great for basically anybody. I feel
exactly.
like that's kind of
Where
like a, well, anyone,
But
anybody
if he
good
went
there.
to, I don't know, Houston or something, if they really liked him, or if he went to Utah, or all this range that's now open with his injury,
Right. It's
is there
bad.
anything you'd be particularly worried about where you'd say, man, that's really going to have to change over the course of his rookie deal for him to start to get where he needs to go?
That's a good question. And I think his floor is pretty context proof. Like I think regardless of where he goes, his ability to get downhill and finish is gonna manifest somewhere and be valuable. Um, in terms of like roster construction, I do think it'll probably be best for him to have like a real screening lob threat big because I don't really think he's ever had that, at least to the degree like that I think he could really take advantage of out of the pick and roll since that's, his bread and butter, just like the high spread pick and roll. That's what he likes to do.
Mm-hmm.
I and then I think ideally I would want a roster with some good like on off type guards, like players who maybe can help him learn how to play on the ball, off the ball, a mix of both of those play types, right? And just kind of be be available to handle and to create when Topic can't and be available to, play off the ball when Topic is on the ball. Because I do think one of my other like macro problems with Topic is just how he fits off the ball and how he adds value without the basketball. And
Mm-hmm.
I think while that's like and it's an it's a less critical concern for Topic than most because I think he can be a legit primary and for legit primaries like it matters being able to play it without the ball, but it doesn't matter as much as it does for 99% of other players. So I think having some kind of good like offense, obviously a good offensive infrastructure is like good for everyone, but I think especially for these players who already are not great at playing off ball, like going to a place like Utah with a Will Hardy would be sick.
Mm-hmm.
Um, whereas like you can put Grady Dick on any team, he's gonna be sick off the ball. Like you don't need to teach him how to do that. Or like Reed or Rob, like you don't need to teach those guys how to play off the ball. Whereas Topic, I think you're gonna need to have that growth instilled. Because I think maybe that, that's another possible path to him being great. It's like maybe he doesn't end up hitting a super high end outcome as an initiator, but like he figures out the catch and shoot jumper. His timing, attacking off the catch is really crazy. And he can impact in that way too.
And that, I think that probably gets more into the Dragic comp that you see from him, because Dragic also would alternate between being more of an initiator and then, I mean, he came off the bench early in his career, and then being a guy who could really like catch and go and attack and be sort of a third offensive option in a given lineup. But I'll put that
Yeah.
comp to the
I don't
side
know
for now.
enough about like prime Dragic to really have an opinion on that comparison aside from me being skeptical because of the obvious, but I'm like
Right, because of the
it makes sense from what from what people say. I'm like, yeah, it's like and like at least like statistically and from what I remember and such, like prime Dragic was like pretty damn good.
Oh, he
Uh,
was great. But I think like
yeah.
the point wasn't to really like pump that. For example, I
Yeah.
think Dragic was a
Yeah.
much more
Yeah, I
creative
got it.
finisher than
Yeah.
Topic is. I mean, that always stuck out to me about how the different solutions that he always had at the rim. But I
I
think
wonder if
going
he
back
was
to,
like that at 18. I have no idea.
I
Honestly.
don't know either because I wasn't doing prospect work when he was coming in, but I was just
So
like,
I
"Whoa,
was
he's
like
cool." That was
a
about the
little
extent of
child when he came out, probably.
it. Yeah, and I considered myself a child, so I mean that would, you know.
Fair enough.
But
Yeah.
anyway, about off the ball, I wanted to make a quick point here because I think that there are, when people hear, he's got to improve off the ball, that connotes maybe that he's sort of like standing in the corner at the beginning of a possession, or that he's off on the wing while other people are doing the action. And I think there are degrees of off the ball, particularly now in the NBA, where so many primary initiators, primary scoring options are bigs or are like giant wings who are getting bigger. It
Yep,
is it
absolutely.
like you could say that Jamal Murray has helped perfected his off the ball game because he engages in this two man with Jokic, and the ball
Oh, no
really
doubt.
should begin in Jokic's hands. I think in a circumstance like that where you have like a jumbo guy who's operating the offense, that Topic can like learn his tendencies and learn where to cut and then still fall back on that pick and roll that he'll still be encouraged to run when he has the ball. I think he'll be able to do that. It's the question is more if there's another guard or wing that has higher pick and roll volume than him, when he's off the ball in that sense, where does it go? And I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you if there was a player that you thought of that was ball heavy coming into the league who then morphed in that way, where they went to a team with a higher pick and roll, like a higher volume pick and
Yeah.
roll guard
I
or
mean, not to bring
option,
him
and
up,
they like really morphed their game.
not to bring him up again, but like look at what Kyrie's doing right now and like what he, became in Cleveland post LeBron. Like I think that's a guy who like never played off ball in his life before the NBA, because he never would have needed to. And now you're seeing, years later, he has an incredible feel for, I think it's like about feel for spacing and angles and understanding when to cut and where to move and being able to attack decisively and confidently. And I think that's where like decision making is so important. And I think Topic is generally a pretty good decision maker. I don't know if you'd agree with that. Um,
I think he is. I
I
think
think
his
so.
assist to
I don't think
turnover
it's like,
ratio is indicative of that, but
yeah,
I
I
wanted
don't
to
think
get to
it's
that
like,
later.
I don't think it's like crazy outstanding, but like, I think the fact that he's a good decision maker on the ball makes me think that he could evolve into a good off ball decision maker. Um, I'm sure there's other examples I could think of, but I
Yeah, I mean,
mean,
it's like, and obviously it's
yeah,
hard to use Kyrie. Like Kyrie's such a
right.
one of
It's like a
one
whatever.
everything
Like
that, yeah. But I,
I think
I
it's a
also just
I think
don't
it's an
know. Go
underratedly
ahead, go ahead.
hard I think it's an underratedly hard skill to develop as well.
That's what has stuck in my head about it because I agree. I think it is a very hard skill to develop. I think it's very encouraging that Topic, when he went to Red Star, when he got called up, his assist to turnover ratio actually improved because he just would not really turn the ball over at all. It was
Yeah,
like
I think it's
over
a good sign for
three
sure.
in his exposure there. And even though he doesn't have a lot of, like you mentioned, East West creativity and breaking people down in his handle, Like that ball is on a string and he knows where to go with it. And his passes, while I think they're more like correct than they are jaw dropping, like if I'm trying to find, like, Kyrie had special feel all over the place where you could project that he'd be able to play in a variety of systems. If I'm trying to find the sort of specialness in Topic's game to where it's not you're either the starting point guard or you're a really good sixth man, to where there is a happy medium where he's a starter contributing to a really good offense, but maybe off of another high pick and roll guy.
Yeah.
Like I'm trying to glom onto something. The free throws are one thing, finishing touch is another. This assist to turnover ratio might be another dimension to it. But what do you make of how low turnover he is? You think it's just that he knows how to get downhill and no one could really stop him, or do you see any other feel within that particular skill?
I honestly think one of my main criticisms of him as a passer is how kind of like risk averse he can be at times when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to high level reads. I do think he's generally like a very smart and careful player with the ball, who doesn't really do reckless stuff, which I appreciate and think is important. And like I said, a good indicator of like the off ball stuff. And assuming like transitioning to talking more about the passing, where it's like I don't necessarily view him as a crazy elite passer because I don't think he consistently will make those high level pick and roll reads and reads out of the confines of the pick and roll. Like he's fantastic, like spread pick and roll, hitting the roller
The
or
roller, right?
drive and skip to the weak corner. Like he can obviously do all of that, like lay downs off of his drives. But I don't think you see him as much like trying tight window passes or inventive stuff off of the dribble or even like as an off-ball passer, right? Like he very rarely will like attack and pass. It's like, okay, I'm gonna back out, reset, and then do my thing. And I see that as definitely somewhat of a limitation when it comes to his high-end playmaking. And for a guy like Topic, as is the case for a lot of elite burst initiators, the level of passer they have to get to is lower than other players, right? Because they have access or the privilege of having bigger windows than everyone because
Mm-hmm.
they just draw so much help because they get to the rim. So Topic doesn't really need to be like a crazy high level passer to be a great player. But I think that is a limiter of his ultimate ceiling, especially off the ball. Because I think off the ball is where a lot of that like creativity, instincts, out of structured playmaking also comes in. And
Yeah.
while I think there's certainly value to being like there's like a risk-free guy, but like we can see issues with players like Monty Morris and like Tyus Jones in the playoffs, especially who like yeah those guys aren't going to turn it over, but they're also not going to put any pressure on you as a playmaker either. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a place where I would like to see Topic improve, and something that I think is another one of those skills that it's. I mean, nothing is really like this, but it's like to an extent, it's you have it or you don't, right? Like
Well,
obviously,
that's what's interesting is because to high level playmakers, the middle of the floor is like heaven. Like they are very comfortable operating there because it maximizes their angles and their options about where to go with the ball. And so many of them, Jokic, Luka, SGA, whomever, will slow down to access and make sure they spend as much time in the middle of the floor as possible. And Topic just bypasses it and gets to the hoop. That's what I said when
right?
I call him a spammer. It
Yeah,
has not been in his game to explore and slow down that area. You mentioned some flashes here or there, but it's
yeah. It's not frequent for
right.
sure.
And so again, if we're projecting out how, if we think it is very important to have that sort of advanced playmaking instinct in order to evolve, I guess, into the best version of this supporting off-ball player, I would I would lean pretty pessimistic on that. But I also there aren't
I think I'd
many.
agree
Yeah,
generally.
I mean it's difficult though. And now if you're looking at well, if he's playing off of a pick and roll guy, then that puts more stress on his catch and shoot, 3-point shooting, not necessarily off the dribble. What do you make of projecting catch and shoot versus off the dribble for him?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think a lot of young guards are better off dribble shooters than catch and shoot. I would say that's probably
Yes.
like more young guards are good off dribble, bad catch and shoot than the inverse. Just because most NBA level guards played on the ball their whole
Right.
formative years. Because like if you're good enough to play at any sort of pro level, you were probably like the best 14-year-old in your city or whatever, right? So I think the touch indicators, as we talked about, are a really good sign. I think he's willing enough to take them. I don't see as many times as I kind of think I would, where I'm like, ooh, I wish he shot that, or like, ooh, he passed up an open shot. I feel like, at least anecdotally, right? And like when I go back and look at my notes, that Topic will take the ones I think he should be taking, but I definitely have some pause. I It's hard not to fear like the Killian Hayes fear, where he just like never figured out how to shoot off the catch. I mean, I don't think that's, I still
Yeah.
think Killian hit like a 0th percentile outcome right as a shooter, and that's
Yeah,
awesome.
and Killian never had the burst that
Yeah, it's like
Topic had.
if that
But
happens
yeah.
to Topic, then he's probably gonna suck. But like, we price those things in where yeah, Topic's off catch shooting numbers this year don't think were very good. He didn't do them often at all. I'm looking right now. Yeah, he had 33 catch and shoot threes, and he shot 27% on them. So like obviously not great, but also a tiny sample, just because like getting back to what we were talking about, he doesn't do it very often. So I think just getting reps is going to be really important. Getting in-game reps is really important. And like I said, I think going to a place where he might have to play off ball early, where like I think Utah, honestly, I would love that, will be really good for him. It's like you have to shoot off the catch to play. It's like there's just no other option. We're not going to let you
Right.
back out and reset every single play in the league. Maybe at some point you get to that level, and I think he can. I think Topic, I mean, hence why I have him like top 5. I think he can
Right.
get to that level,
Right.
but obviously a chance he doesn't. But I definitely, on like the off-ball shooting, I certainly am not like super optimistic about it. I think it can get to a point where it's good enough to where we're not freaking out about it, or it's not a total like disaster issue. But
So
it really
let's
is about like being comfortable, I think.
so I agree with basically all of that. And I think in when I have tried to rank him, for whatever that's worth, that has stayed in my head about like if the catch and shoot stuff isn't there, this really is like I said, you're either a top 2 option or
A
you're
six
probably coming
man.
off the bench. And let's though, since poor Topic is having a rough enough week with this ACL news coming out, let's go to extremely optimistic to where like he comes back healthy and the Spurs draft him. So now he's in the best context he can possibly think of.
Yeah,
Do, do
amazing.
you believe that as a point guard, stacking up against other, he's not going to be a primary initiator, but as other like high volume pick and roll guys, that he's in like he could get to like that Fox space where he's now like borderline all NBA in those discussions. Team's obviously really good and he's contributing like that level or even higher.
I think so. Probably not higher. I think there's always going to be some inherent flaws in his game, whether that's his, limited vertical explosion, some of the off-ball stuff. And again, like that's why I have him at number 4 in a bad draft. Like,
Right.
and also why like ordinal rankings are basically meaningless, right? Because like I can have him at 4, but if you're a team that doesn't really need that kind of initiator now or in the future, like he's probably not going to be that high on your board. So it doesn't really matter where I have him ranked.
It's tough. Yeah.
By
It's difficult.
ranking 1 through 30 in a vacuum is a pretty I think not like it's not totally useless, but it's not a very fruitful exercise. But I
I,
do think that
yeah.
Topic can reach the heights of like a Fox level impact, or like current like LaMelo level impact. Um, Someone obviously like in very it'll look very different than all these players that we're mentioning, but just in like a top 30 to 40-ish player, right, who is making and contending for all-star games. Fox was not an all-star this year, I think, or was he?
He was like right down to the last spot. That might have gone to
Yeah,
Cat, and he and Sabonis might have both gotten shafted. I don't remember. It was
yeah.
close.
I don't think he was an all-star this year. At least I don't remember. But yeah, like point being, I absolutely think Topic at his ceiling can be that guy. And I think the floor for him is probably better than people, better than others would think, assuming he's healthy, obviously, which is a big,
Of
I can't
course.
speak
Of
on that.
course.
Because I think at the very least, his rim pressure is going to make him useful. Um, I'll say. but at the, at his ultimate ceiling, and hence, right, like I have him top 5 in this class for a reason. I think he can be that guy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I it has been helpful to go through, especially in picturing just how that rim pressure is always going to be there. Because again, no matter what your context, and we can quibble, but no matter what your context, you always want someone who can get to the rim in a hurry and finish there
I
and
always,
have
yeah.
options, even if it's not Luka level set of options to either score or pass out, which he
This
will
is an
always have.
extreme ex the extreme example that I always think of is a guy like Fultz who hit a 0th percentile outcome as a shooter and
Hmm.
still is a useful rotation guard because he can get to the paint whenever he wants. Obviously, Topic isn't prospect Fultz or anything, but I think that's, an example of, right. It's like, even if this guy's not as good as we think, like in the case of Fultz, it's like literally everything that could go wrong goes wrong. He's
Hmm.
still going to have some utility as like a rotation guy because of his special traits. And I think that's ultimately where I land on Topic and most prospects. And that's, how I building my personal philosophy around ceiling and these special traits. Cause I'm like, this stuff isn't going away, even if Topic doesn't improve in other ways. So
Yeah, and I wouldn't even, again, health permitting, I don't really have any fear of Topic washing out because there's just too much talent
yeah,
at too young an age, and he has positional size. We haven't talked much about the defense. There's not, I mean,
yeah, I think
go
it's a
ahead. I mean, you
less
can if you want.
interesting
Yeah,
and comprehensive discussion, right? I
right.
mean,
And
he's bad and
but it also, I think, for the point that it leads to is that I find it unlikely that the team that drafts him is going to give him too much leash as this off-ball guy, because if you are even the third offensive option, which is still a massive offensive responsibility on a given team, your defensive responsibilities creep up and you need to hit a certain level. And
yeah,
so I would think that wherever he goes wants to draft him for his strengths, which are on the ball. And that will just lead to less focus. It will go more into hiding his defense than anything else. And then before you know it, I worry that like this off-ball version that we've been speculating on never really comes to fruition unless he's in a two-man game with, again, like a 7 foot plus guy, which might be why the Spurs like him. But that's sort of
could be,
my
yeah.
thought on it. Yeah.
Yeah, and like I said, I don't think any of those concerns are invalid, and I just think like I priced those into my evaluation of his upside. And again, if I didn't have those concerns, like I could see a case for him at number one if some of
Mm-hmm.
these concerns weren't as legit. I think Topic's defense is bad, but I don't think it's hopeless. I think it's extremely common for young high usage initiators to suck on defense. If it's, hard to find ones who are actually good defenders.
Right.
It's very rare.
Right.
Most of them, ball watch and sit out of position. And I think Topic is like pretty good positioning awareness, just like his physical tools are problematic in a way that like his big offensive athletic advantages like don't really like matter as much on defense, like running in a straight line, accelerating. I think that could help his like lateral quickness for sure, but he's very raw, and I think like it's I hate to just chalk it up to he needs to add strength, but he needs to add strength because he
Yeah.
is 6'5" and he's, a reasonably good athlete. And if he gets even like median strong, I could totally see him being solid. Um, so like defense isn't a thing where because of his upside as a primary, I don't worry as much about. But I do agree with you that if you are a person who values median outcomes more in their philosophy than I do, then his defensive responsibilities, if he's not that legit star primary, are going to have to be higher. But I do think it's possible. Like
Yeah.
I've seen plenty worse defenders or plenty of terrible freshman defenders end up being good defenders. Like I don't think it's uncommon that this happens.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Great. Anything else that you want to hit on him before we move on?
I think we covered a good amount. I will say, like the I guess like consensus eval of topics to me has been really weird. And maybe it's just like stereotypes that people perceive him as like a slow guard who can't create advantages, who's like elite passer. Like I'm sure you've seen the Giddy comparisons for him, which
Mm-hmm.
to me are just like could not be more off. Like can think of very little actual similarities in their games aside from like being vertically challenged and shaky shooters. But I think top like
He's
betting
a
on
better shooting prospect than Giddy was,
oh
though.
yeah.
I mean,
Oh yeah,
yeah,
for sure. And I
yeah,
think Topic is a worthwhile, just a very worthwhile high-end bet, assuming medicals check out, which is of course the big if. We don't need to spend any more time talking about
right.
medicals because we're not doctors, unfortunately, for our bank accounts. But and maybe not fortunately for our sanity, but Topic is
Yeah,
great, man. I think he in a league where advantage creation, rim pressure, initiators still matter so much. And I think Topic is as good a bet as anyone in this class, where most great classes have like at least one elite initiator bet, like, you know, a Luca or an Ant or a LaMelo or a Zion or a Cade or whoever. This class does not have that guy. But I think for like the second tier initiator prospects, I think Topic is a pretty good option. So I would really like him in a lot of the spots that don't need primaries. Like I think Washington makes a lot of sense for him as a potential spot. As we talked about, like Utah, San Antonio would both be awesome. But I do ultimately lean very quite positive, I'd say, on Topic, despite acknowledging his issues, which are very real. But the ceiling to me is clearly a top three, maybe top five ceiling in the class. Like he could be very
yeah. I mean, it'd be really, obviously, really fun if he ends up in San Antonio. I mean, that would also be a. I don't know if it's like a full statement from the organization that like this is going to be the guy that we believe Wembanyama can grow with. I think they could probably just as easily draft Topic and sign Malik
they're
Monk or
saying
whatever.
something,
But
I think, maybe
but a
because
little bit right. But like with Wemby, there's you can have your kind of pick of the litter to a certain extent, about who you want to pair him with because so many players are interested with playing with him. And it
yeah,
would just be really interesting if they kind of kept their purse strings relatively tight this offseason and drafted Topic and a wing and said, we believe in this crew and this group,
yeah.
but we'll
I
see.
don't think that would necessarily be a bad approach. I think there's pros and cons to, that versus like the just sign guys now, but I certainly would understand if that was the way that they wanted to go.
Yeah. Yeah, I would be very interested to see them go after Monk, but we'll see. We'll see.
That would be cool.
All right, so
I mean, I feel like
Khalil,
Monk is good for like everyone.
I
Like,
know that's why I would love him in San
yes.
Antonio with Wembanyama. But let's talk about Khalil Ware. Vastly different prospect, but one whose stock is rising pretty consistently to the point where I could see him and Topic being selected within like 3 picks of each other now in the draft. I think that
Yeah.
is not
I
out of
think
the
it's
realm of
probably more because
possibility.
of Topic's fault, like Topic stuff than Khalil. But yeah, I do think people are
Sure.
like finally getting around to how good this dude could be.
And
Uh,
so, yeah, and you're a huge fan of his. And Khalil was, I think, about 16 and 10 this year, with like healthy block numbers. He crushed the combine. He's 7 foot or 7'1" in shoes with like a 7'4", 7'5" wingspan. Was a huge, huge prospect prior to his first year at Oregon before transferring to Indiana. Was always young for his class. He's basically freshman age now, turning 20 this summer, which is what most one and dones do. And if you
yeah, I
view
mean,
him as like that age, then his production, his numerical production, is like clearly top 10 worthy in a class like this.
he's younger than Klingon. He's obviously way younger than like Edier. He's younger than Filipowski. He's like a month older than Misi. Yeah, he is really young, and I think Flip is a guy I've not Flip. Ware is a guy I've always liked going back to high school. I think he flashed good stuff at Oregon, and obviously the situation was not right for any party at Oregon. But then he comes to Indiana, and I think I had him lottery preseason, which was not a common opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And he's very much put together what people thought he could become. And I think his development this year is really encouraging. I still have my issues with him. Like he's a guy who like I wish I could have higher, but in good conscience, like can't put like top five or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But he is very, very good. And I think um people may be surprised by how high he goes, honestly.
Well, I think now it's starting to sink in, especially I've always considered Lively's rookie season to be very good for Khalil in terms of what teams envision they might be able to use offensively with them, even though I think they are vastly different players. And I
Oh
think,
yeah,
again,
very.
personally, with my evaluation of him, the problem I keep running into with him is that I think I hold against him probably too much um where he is in terms of his really his defensive improvisation and processing, because I still consider that pretty raw. I still think that he can be a
I agree
big
with that.
deterrent. His measurables are great. When he gets off the ground, he can reach and affect a lot of shots, but I think that he is late to react, late to get off the ground a lot, and sort of late in his reads, but he is still very young. So
Yeah.
talk about what you think he improved on so much in Indiana this year that has you thinking that he's like on a very, not like on a relatively smooth upward trajectory.
Sure. So aside from like the obvious production and all of that good stuff, I do think his like physicality and motor got better this year. Obviously, I think that's like the big overarching concern, that it's like hard to really bet so hard on a guy who has the kind of like effort and feel and motor issues that Ware does. I'm not usually like a huge like motor guy in terms of like knocking it
Yeah.
down, but I think
Nor am
like,
I, but yeah,
the
go
the
ahead.
case of Ware seems like significant enough. And I think there's plenty of um examples on tape where, to your point, I think it's hard to know, at least from my perspective, whether some plays are like, okay, Khalil isn't trying, or he's not seeing the play quickly enough. And I think that's something that's teams are going to have to parse out, that can actually, talk to Khalil and talk to Woodson and the coaches and figure out what that is. Because I think, honestly, probably better if it's just like he's not seeing the game quick enough. Not a great thing, right? But I feel
Right.
like I'd rather have a guy like that than someone who just doesn't give a shit.
And for
Um,
the record, that's what I think it is. When I see it,
I think
that's
so too.
constantly what
I
I
think so
think it
too.
is that
I
he's
think so
not
too. I think
getting
it's
it.
unfair to like totally assume he has like no motor and doesn't care. Like I don't know.
Right.
I think it's generally like a bad stance to take, like for teenagers, right?
Right.
But I guess so, like broadly why I like Khalil so much, which I can talk about, is
Yes,
I
please
think
do.
my best like high end optimistic outcome for him is like a Brook Lopez type, um, where he's just enormous and a monster in drop coverage and parking at the rim, with some spacing stuff and post scoring. And I think that's like a good high end comp as well, because I think they have similar like stiffness limitations, where I think defensively Khalil's upside is really high. Like that's his tools are unbelievable. His ability to protect the rim and rotate and make these big explosive blocks are real. I think that's real. I think it's been real since high school. His best athletic trait to me is his ability to get off the floor quickly. Like he has zero load time on his jumps, which is so valuable. Like he never needs to like bend his knees or swing his arms. He's just straight up off the floor. And having that along with a guy with his kind of athletic tools is really, really, really valuable. And I think Ware is is like enormous and coordinated, but like the positioning is really raw. He'll be like too high or too low in drop, or like out of the way of a drive. He's not a great isolation defender anywhere, just because of his like technique, like hunching over. But I think his physicality and his feel, especially on offense, got better this year, where he seemed more comfortable making plays out of the post, more comfortable making some basic short roll stuff. I do think
Hmm.
there are offensive field questions, but I also think we talked about Topic, like Khalil is someone such an incredible scorer at this level that oftentimes like the quote unquote wrong decision is fine. And I think Khalil is obviously the spacing with him is really enticing. Even though he didn't shoot a ton of threes this year, I think a lot of that is probably on like Woodson and the way that Indiana does their things, right? Because like he was much more willing and able to shoot threes at Oregon even, and he was a much better and higher volume shooter in high school than he is at Indiana. So I think he can get to like a, with a type where he's hitting corner threes and hitting above the break threes and stuff that just pulls defenses out, right? I don't need him to get to like a crazy high level of shooting, but I think he can get to one where he is going to be threatening enough. And then to me, he's a really absurd interior scorer, not just as a lob and dunk finisher, which he's great. Like that's we know that, but just an incredible post scorer with amazing touch in the mid range on fadeaways and hooks. He has a pretty deep toolbox of footwork and body angles and stuff. And I think we saw, which is another like question, Oregon, like in games, he is willing to like be the most physical, biggest guy on the court and just like beat the crap out of people. His free throw rate a lot, I believe, better than last year. In general, yeah, his free throw rate went up. His finishing went way up. The ability to be physical and to impose his size, I think, got a lot better. So I see Kel'el Ware as one of the main true like high ceiling, low floor bets in this class. Like I could totally imagine a world where Khalil maybe never develops a jumper and the defensive feel and positioning is just way too inconsistent to ever make it work. Like he's
Mm-hmm.
like I could see him like Jackson Hazing it. It's gonna look different, but like I
Mm-hmm.
could imagine like a Jackson Hayes or Mo Bamba type outcome for him. But I could also imagine him, like I said, looking like a Brooke Lopez type or someone like that who's like a clearly very valuable defensive piece with real offensive utility, even if I don't think he's going to be like a consistent all-star type or anything. And I think in this draft, like you can make a pretty good case that that's worth a high-ish pick.
I make a case, certainly. I also think it's important to remember that, like, again, I did vastly different player than Lively, but like it's not going to be something where he comes in and a good team finds themselves giving Khalil, 15 minutes a game next year. I just think the positioning is too raw for him to step in and be a positive
I think
rotation
Lively is
guy.
also like such a special outlier case that we probably shouldn't be like using it as a comparison sport. Not saying
That's
like,
what that's what
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean though.
yeah,
Like,
yeah. I'm echoing that, right? Because I'm like,
yeah.
Lively was like bad the first half of the season at Duke, and he was bad in high school, and then all of a sudden he flips a switch, and I was like, holy shit, this guy's incredibly good.
Yeah, but like his special trait though is his sort of defensive awareness and communication. He also, I think, is just very strong through his core in a way that Khalil is not yet, though that can obviously be remedied. But I, when you mentioned his touch in the mid range, which is really, really good, what sticks out to me when I watch him is just what a good vertical scorer he is, and whether that's trying to finish stuff that other people set up for him as a lob threat, or just his ability to rise and with his release point be comfortable at different angles in the mid range releasing the ball. That's what leads me to believe that the jumper stuff is somewhat real, even though our old friend free throw percentage is not quite there for him yet. I
Yeah,
I want to believe that that offensive stuff is good enough that there is a place for him to start on an NBA team down the line. And if there is, then top 10 really starts to make sense. But do you believe that it is more likely that he will provide more value on offense than defense, or vice versa?
I think at a floor offense, at a ceiling defense. I think if he cleans up the positioning awareness stuff, he could be a legitimate like a guy who like sniffs all defense. Probably won't get there, but like
Mm-hmm.
a guy who's on people's short list for that, just because of how dominant he's going to be defending the rim. And I think if he continues to improve his mobility, I think the big limitation for Ware on defense, aside from his mental stuff, is just that his hips are kind of high and stiff. And I think that limits his ability to play at the level and cover ground. But
Mm-hmm.
I think like another good like flourish for him is like Bagley type, who's like just like total traffic cone on defense, but like gets minutes because he can rebound and score on the post and finish. And I think Khalil's offense is probably going to be good enough. And I think like maybe the Bomba like Hayes floor is a little unfair because those guys just never had the kind of offensive skill set that Ware has,
Mm-hmm.
which I do think provides some kind of a floor where, you know, even if everything doesn't necessarily go like it should, Ware's probably gonna be able to be a guy who can get touches in the post off of your bench and catch lobs and get offensive rebounds and do stuff that, isn't necessarily top pick valuable, but will get you in a rotation. So I think
What?
my answer
Yeah.
is like, yes, I think at his like, if things don't go well, I think he'll probably be good enough to stick at least on offense. But if things go well, I think it's going to be because of his defense.
And what about how do you think he compared another guy who was kind of stiff but had really good offensive indicators? You spent a couple years in school and is on your Indiana Pacers, which is Jalen Smith. How do you think Kel'el compares to Jalen? I think Khalil's just probably like a bigger guy, better measurables. But how do you think he compares to him in his eventual role?
Um, that's interesting. I think Smith, like, I think Smith's feel in college was like considerably worse than Ware's. And I think that's saying something.
Really? Goodness
Yeah,
gracious.
I thought he was always like a major black hole. And I think he still is. Unfortunately, like we saw whenever that he tried to play in the playoffs, it
Yeah, and
wasn't all
that's
that
right.
great.
Lost his spot. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I think Ware's size, like you said, is a big difference there. Where like Smith is like probably just like a tick below real five size.
Hmm.
Oh, it's kind of hard to justify playing him at the five, but like Ware is like obviously a ginormous person, right? And I think um Sticks, at least to my memory, it was mostly just like winning with size and strength and touch stuff, where I think Ware is a little more skilled, um, and just like a more impactful offensive guy. But I do see the similarities as like a floor, right? And I think even if it looks different, like I mean, I guess I never would have guessed Jalen Smith ended up looking like he does in Indiana. I think it's kind of crazy that he's like a basically just like an off-ball shooter now. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, like he is good enough to be in a rotation because of his offense. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's fair.
The more I think about him, about Khalil, that is, I am starting to get a little tempted by just improving the feel and awareness little by little, over the
Right.
course of his
And I think the
career.
NBA is pretty good at raising the baseline for that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I value, so this is kind of like a philosophy lesson I think I've learned over my years is like, yeah, like you can't, there's some level of feel and instinct you can't teach, obviously. But I think the NBA is better at getting guys to be good enough at pretty much all levels. I think about, think of examples like all over the board at pretty much any position. Like Jalen is a one that comes to my mind immediately, or even like Miles Turner. Thinking
Hmm.
on like the Pacers thing where those guys are never going to be like elite decision maker feel types, but they can be good enough to supplement their other traits. And I think that's a point that I think optimistically about Khalil. It's like I don't need this guy to be a savant for him to be a good player. Like I just need him to be good enough. And I think that's within the realm of possibility, at least enough within the realm for me to feel confident using at least a top 20 pick on him. Like I'm not saying I take him in like the, clearly in the top 10 or anything, but
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think it's possible that the league values that though.
I am I am almost there with you. I mean, I have him in the top 20. I am almost
Yeah.
there with you in being
And I've
more.
also gone back and forth on him to be like he's a guy who I've gone back and forth on too. But like I said, I'm very curious to see where he lands, honestly.
I am too, because I think, like I said, I worry if he goes high that more will be expected out of him early than it should. But that also might just mean that he hits for team number two more so than team number one. Like we've noted this, but the positional size that he's got, it is very significant that this guy is bigger than normal NBA fives are. And when
He's
you go back and you look at guys who,
gigantic.
yeah,
Like
when they outperform their draft slot, frequently it's because you realize, oh, they actually crushed the combine and they were big for their position, and whatever nits to be picked that there were, it just sort of got steamrolled by the fact that they have clear NBA skill and they're going to be an asset, size wise at their spot.
right.
And
And I think
so he's
where
got all that. Yeah.
um there are a couple like I've mocked in my mocks for fun and like for work. I've given him to the Pelicans a lot. I think that would be great. Um,
Hmm.
just like fit wise. I I will spoil something that I have coming out, I believe Friday. So I've been working on a project on basically tracking all of OKC's past draft picks in Sam Presti's tenure, and basically like formalizing what kind of indicators he tends to look for and who is who most fits that in the draft. And do you want to guess the prospect that is the number one cleanest Sam Presti fit in the entire draft?
I'll guess Kel'el Ware. Is that
It
it?
is Kel'el Ware. That's a great guess. Which is not
Yeah.
something I would have guessed coming into that. But like he has crazy wingspan. He's young and productive. Presti loves his like BPM guys, and his BPM is crazy. His assist to turnover ratio numbers are good. His shooting numbers are good for his size. His free throw, his rebounding numbers are good. So that's a sneaky spot that I'm like, and like I said, I'm gonna have a piece on this on Friday, June 7th, I believe, when whenever you're listening to this. But I'm like, like it wouldn't shock me to see the Thunder being like, I like this
Yeah.
guy
I mean,
side. We're gonna take a shot.
it's like
We're gonna trust our development and take a shot. Like,
I do wonder about some of these teams and like the timelines with him. Because the one thing, even if I am optimistic about this feel improving little by little, it is little by little. And a lot of these teams aren't going to maybe
yeah.
not Presti because Presti has such job security, but some other teams are not really in that position.
And I think,
And
yeah,
yeah,
I think
yeah.
if you're looking for a center right now, you should probably look elsewhere. But
Hmm.
one, if you're either a bad team who, has time, or a smart team like, OKC, Miami, whoever, who like knows the value of contingency plans and setting yourself up well for the future in a position that might not be a huge need, but because of contracts or aging or whatever, might be a need down the road. And I think that could be something for like, the teams like maybe we don't have a gap at center right now, but we trust our development. And in 2 years, we're not going to want to pay this guy. And we hope Ware can step in. So I think that could be a thought process. But yeah, I generally agree that if you're like a team that's like, we need a center to play tomorrow, I probably would look elsewhere.
And like again, we haven't made this point, but so many teams are, tripping over themselves to try to find any sort of five that can space. So if the shooting is real enough, that like his ceiling is
Yeah.
very high. It's just I
Yeah.
tend to try to associate high ceilings with extremely high feel players because that's sort of what I see around the league more often than not.
Yeah.
But
I think that's generally the case.
but as a supplementary piece, he could be an extremely valuable supplementary piece. Someone like
Absolutely.
who plays and starts in the playoffs level of supplementary
For sure.
piece if it all were
I
to
think
work out.
that's the optimistic outcome. And I think for me that's enough to have him as a lottery level guy. Like I said,
Right.
I depending on your personal draft philosophy and such. And of course, like I said, like if a certain team was, that needed a center was picking at 10, I think he would be a terrible pick. But if a certain team that like had a great infrastructure needed a guy, like pick him at 10, sure. Where
Yeah.
it's in, especially with how flat this draft is, it's like
Well,
um
yeah, and like again, I drafts are defined almost always by who you pass up. Like what are you forsaking in order to take a
right.
shot on
And
this
that's kind
guy?
of, yeah, that's how I
Like
feel fair too.
that's what
Like,
I mean. Like he has the ability to really flip that table to be like, well, I took this really imperfect wing because I think the league is about wings, and I passed on this 7-2 guy that can really, warp the
right. Or it's
construction of a
like
team.
I feel, or like, that's a big part of my thoughts. Like, I feel good about taking this guy with more downside because I will kick myself if someone else takes him and he hits.
Right.
It's like, I want that to be our team. And I think Ware is like, yeah, if, there's a decent chance he misses, but if you pass on Ware and you let one of your rivals get him, it's like, shit. Like,
Yeah,
I
now we got to deal
really,
with this
really
guy.
wish we had that guy.
Right,
And
right.
we could have. But, and that's ultimately how I see upside in a lot of cases. But for the case of Ware, I think is one of the more extreme ceiling floor dichotomies. But yeah,
Yeah. I did like again when you mentioned things like Jackson Hayes and Bamba, I'd have to go back and look at Mo Bamba. I mean, let's see what he actually averaged. He was 13 and 10 and a half. All right. I
it was
just
like a
like
little. That was like the like I have like kind of know about Bamba, but like I think Bamba's feel was like outlier bad.
mm-hmm.
Like and that's probably like a like Ware certainly has like as we talked about plenty of mental stuff, but I don't think he's like a total black hole unsavable. Like I don't know if you remember like Daniel Oturu or
Yeah, I remember
like
him.
Kabengele types who just like we're always going to be like black holes to the point of probably not being able to make it. And I don't think Ware is like that, even if it's not great.
Yeah. Okay. Well, going to the opposite end, really like an inversion of the skill set.
Yeah,
Dillon Jones,
let's
Weber
go.
State. I'm gonna give you the floor again, but I'll just read some of Dillon's just raw
Yeah, you
numbers here.
can do your thing for sure.
21, 10 rebounds, 5 assists. Probably the only person in the country to meet all of those, just those thresholds.
Probably, yeah.
Uh, Positive assist to turnover ratio. Let's see. Or did I read this right? No, I got him. Yeah. Positive assist to turnover ratio. 2 steals a game. His steal rate has been around 3 all his years at Weber. One of the most unique physical talents in the class. He, I think, has around a 6'11" wingspan. He's like a 6'5" guard,
Yeah, it's six
230.
4.5 in shoes, 6'11 wingspan, 236-ish, I think. It's
And
strange.
he is another below the rim guy, but is in full control of how he wants to operate at any given time. And how he wants to operate, you just came out with a video on Dillon, is he has a very creative handle, but he lacks tons of like tons of explosion that you would archetypally see in an NBA player. He's
Yeah,
not
kind of
this
like an inverse Topic in that way too. Like,
right. He's not this incredibly graceful, lithe sort of body type blowing by people.
yeah, I mean
He's
yeah.
he's more of like a brick wall with like an extremely advanced understanding of the game.
I mean, he's built
Because
like a fullback, like in the nicest way possible. Like
or like like a defensive end or a
yeah,
linebacker. Like I
exactly.
mean,
Like,
but when he gets going, when he is comfortable, Dillon, what he loves to do the most to me is what your video hit on so much, which is warp the court with his passing vision. Because no one in this draft, at least that I have seen, marries sort of wingspan and physical traits with passing vision the way that Dillon does. And
oh yeah.
his eval comes down to how much you value that skill in a body that isn't going to consistently create advantages out of whole cloth against NBA athletes.
Yeah.
That's what makes him so confounding to me and why I want to have this discussion.
And I
But
think he
go ahead.
could develop into a better advantage creator than he is right now. Because I think, as I touched on that video, he's not like he has his issues, but he's not bad in that regard. And I think my elevator pitch for Dillon Jones, it's like he has these really special, unique traits, right? His incredible vision as a playmaker, his amazing strength creation and foul
Mm-hmm.
drawing, his craft as a scorer in the mid range. And I say, hey, maybe we don't know how this is going to look in the NBA, but that's how a lot of breakout stars and great role players are. It's like, I don't really know how this is going to work, so I'm going to fade it. And then it's like, oh, he figured out some weird, unexpected way to contribute. And I see Jones as a prime example. As I mentioned, he's like, it's like, what if Kyle Anderson had a little Siakam in him? Um, I think Jones is like an impossible player to comp for just because of how utterly unique he is. But I think
Yeah.
he's one of the more interesting upside swings in this class to me, just because of his, like I said, his rare body type and physical tools and his feel and his skill. Like just not a lot of players that have that, like have his combination of stuff. And a lot of times the ones that do end up being stars. Like
Yeah. No one has his precise combination of what he's got. He'd be a first round pick. I think he still might go in the first round, but he would be a consensus first round pick. I think if teams are more confident in his 3-point shooting, which
yeah.
I think is not terrible, honestly. And I think that
No.
he's made, I guess, about 33s per year the last 3 years. Percentage, like his best year was 36% in 2022, but he will take threes off of the dribble like frequently
But
because that's his role on his
if
team.
Dillon has an NBA season where he shoots 36% from three on like 5 attempts per 100, he's probably going to be awesome.
Yeah.
Like he's
Yeah.
probably going to be ridiculous if that ends up being the case. And like you said, with his like with regard to his shooting, it is like a mostly, and one of the most interesting things about Dillon that like this is to kind of also more of our like earlier topic conversation is Dillon is a brilliant off-ball spacer. Like he spaces and moves on the perimeter like he's a 40% shooter. Like his feel for angles and timing and like where to slot himself into when players drive or when someone digs or after an offensive rebound. It's really uncanny and kind of odd for someone who isn't a great shooter and has a lot of mechanical issues. Like most of these guys do not feel the game off the ball like Dillon does. It's a weird skill because it's like he can't take advantage of it to the fullest because of his off-ball shooting issues. But I'm like, man, if he improved, like he has the feel and skill to get himself great looks all the time as an off-ball player too. So it's not like he's pigeon. Obviously, he's like a giga usage primary at at Weber State who basically like plays point guard on offense and center on defense. Like you can kind of throw most of that out, honestly, in terms of projecting forward. But
Yeah, I mean, a 31 defensive rebounding rate and a 31 assist rate in the same season, and 35 and 24 last year.
I wonder
I
how many
mean,
players have done that 30-30. I'm gonna look that up right now.
yeah, I can't
It
imagine
can't be
it's
many,
many.
right?
Can it? Maybe like Trevion Williams sniffed it. I
What
don't
a
know.
goat. Have you watched any what's his
What
name?
for
Daddy?
dad for Daddy? Yeah, yeah.
It's so sick. I'm like, oh, I'm like, hey, I know that guy.
Yeah, it's fun. It's a fun team for sure.
Okay, yeah. Want to guess how many players in the Bartorvik database, aside from Dillon Jones, are 30-30 defensive rebound assist rate?
I don't know, like two? I have no idea.
Zero. It's just full stop nobody.
Yeah.
Um, if you lower them to 25-25, you get like Ben Simmons, Kyle Anderson, and then a bunch of and Trevion. There you go. Good call.
Boom. There we go.
And names that I know: Trevion, Jake Stevens, Ethan Happ. That's hilarious. Cam Crutwig,
Cam.
Amari Williams.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's like a good kind of analog of how ridiculously unique Dillon is. And I think for a lot of these really unique players, people kind of tend to fade them because they don't have a comparison in their head or they can't really envision how they would look. Whereas to me, like I like these unique, weird body type skill set guys because I think people in the league who are much smarter than I am will be able to see these traits and like think of ways to use them and to get the most out of them. And I think for a guy like Dillon, who is like again, like I could totally imagine him doing stuff as like a high post guy, like with his mid range and face up scoring. Like I could see him being like a secondary pick and roll guy, right? With his great pick and roll passing. I could see him being like a downhill, like off the catch driver with that skill. I don't know exactly what's going to happen with him, but I think there's a world where he's really good on offense, especially if the shot holds up, which I feel like most of the time it's more complicated than like if he's going to shoot the ball well, it's going to work. But I think for Dillon, it's one of the cases where I'm like, if he's a good pull up shooter, he's going to be a stud. Like,
Yeah. And I
if he's
want to
not, he probably won't be.
I want to dwell on his passing talent a little bit more, just
Oh,
because
up to.
when we like, there's not many people who pass even in the NBA the way that he does, because he will, you can be a high post passer where you are really setting up back to the basket in order to survey the floor to deliver the ball wherever it's going to
I have a
go.
weird NBA passing analog for Jones. I think the closest in terms of passing usage and like play types, honestly, to me is like Şengün as like a middle of the floor, like guard is
Okay.
Şengün as like a middle of the floor cutters skip guy. Very different, but like I'm like, yeah, like that's kind of like a weird player type. But yeah, I agree with you that his passing is very unique. As I said in my video, I tried to post a clip of his like skip passes that just was like totally like disgusting static. that I like scheduled
What,
overnight.
on Twitter? Yeah.
Yeah, I like scheduled overnight and went to bed, and I'm like, oh my God, I woke up to like a million notifications. I'm like, what the hell is this? But Dillon's ability, yeah, like we said, to flip the court as a playmaker is really valuable. Where whether that's from the top of the key, from the post, from the middle of the floor, like he can hit high leverage, tight window skip passes with both hands with perfect accuracy and timing. Like this is a rare skill set.
And because he doesn't have like the easy blow by ability, when he tries to set a defender up, he'll go into his handle where he has a legitimate like bag of tricks to try to at least wrong foot them to get to a step back or something like that. But what I wanted to ask you was, when I've seen him do that, usually when he tries to break a defender down, it is with the intention of scoring. Do you see him chaining a lot of that stuff together and still accessing his passing sort of at the end of that little tete-a-tete that he might have with a defender?
I think I've seen enough of that to be confident. And yeah, I do think he's relatively good at blending his scoring and passing. And oftentimes I think he's a good enough scorer to where it doesn't really even matter. Like he can
Mm-hmm.
make these like ill-advised shots because he's so strong and his touch is awesome. Um, Also like I have a thought about like the advantage creation where he definitely struggles to like get by guys cleanly, but I feel like there are times where he will like get an initial advantage with explosion or separation and then just like not take it and then back out because he's more comfortable working from like a position of like post ups or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. But for like the passing and scoring, I think he's like really good at like playing the middle of the floor, reading it out, drawing help, and making the read. I definitely think he's not like an elite laydown passer. He doesn't always find those like tight window cutters or dunker spot guys for sure. I think that's an accurate criticism of his playmaking. But I do think, right, like out of the pick and roll, out of the post, and from the middle of the floor, he's just absurdly lethal. And it is very hard to play against a guy who is like a reactive god in the way that he'll like punish defensive mistakes, but also will throw guys open with manipulation and his own scoring gravity and stuff like that.
One way to try to figure out that it's not like an actual technique, but a thought that floats in my head when trying to project whether someone is actually going to be an NBA player, especially for an upperclassman like this, is to be like, well, if he gets drafted or if he catches on somewhere and he starts out in the G League, will he just annihilate the G League offensively? And that is something I feel pretty confident about Dillon doing.
Yes,
That
he
like,
would. Absolutely.
yeah, with a dearth of rim protectors and like defensive mistakes galore, would he just tear it to
He
shreds?
would
And I think he
rip the hell
absolutely
out of the
would.
G League. He would rip the G League apart. Like,
And his year, you mentioned Şengün as like an odd comp. I have an odd comp, not in play style, but in sort of career arc. So Dillon, his first couple years, was not like the usage monster, almost heliocentric guy at Weber that he was his last
oh yeah,
two.
definitely heliocentric, I think.
And yeah, I just hate the word, but yeah, I agree. Um, he was around 20 usage as a freshman, sophomore, 21, 22. And his
Still really
efficiency
good.
was like through the roof. He was 64 true shooting one year, 65 true shooting the other year, still had this crazy defensive rebounding rate. He's efficient from every area of the floor except three. And his free throws are like have always been around 80% or better. Like, and his free throw rate's always been really high. Then when he becomes the Helio guy, the guy, efficiency is still good, but takes a natural little bit of a dip to like high 50s, 57, 58 and a half. And a player who went undrafted, though kind of he manicured his undraftedness recently, that had a similar sort of usage split over the course of his career is Austin Reeves. And Austin, again, radically different player type, but there were questions about his translation, his athleticism, his ability to hold up on defense. But his feel was so high, and he had offensive stuff that like was clearly like probably more clearly translatable than Dillon's because he had, the 3-point track record,
Sure,
especially
yeah.
as a catch and shoot guy at Wichita. But there was enough there as an offensive engine, a high usage guy, that he just sort of found his way relatively quickly playing off of better guys. And I wonder, the threes are going to need to go in, but his touch from everywhere else suggests to me that like I can be kind of optimistic about that. And I
Yeah.
wonder if you look up and Dillon is sort of like a third or fourth best guy on like a reasonable team just because of all the other stuff that he can provide, even
Right.
if the defense is not ideal in the same way that Austin's is not ideal.
And I think Dillon is like there's a pretty good track record of these like very elite college mid-range shot creators expanding that out to three. Like Siakam, Tatum, Kawhi, like lower level examples like Warren or someone where players who are just like
TJ,
really
you mean TJ
yes,
Warren?
yes.
Still on the Pacers, right? He's a Pacer.
I think he's
Is
a
he not?
Wolf,
Oh, he's a Wolf. I remember seeing him on the bench in the playoffs.
right?
Sorry. Can go
Yeah, he is
ahead.
a
Go ahead.
Wolf.
Yeah.
Pacers legend, but he's a Wolf.
Yeah.
Where I think Dillon is a guy who like wouldn't shock me to see him take like a pretty crazy like to take a leap as a 3-point pull-up shooter because he's just so incredibly gifted as a mid-range shooter, right? Like I think this is a really positive indicator. These like lower volume types who end up actually, outperforming their maybe expected shooting. Like people don't really expect them to shoot like that because they weren't good shooters or weren't prolific high volume shooters in college. But it's like, oh wow, this guy ended up actually being able to kind of do it. I even think of a guy like PJ Washington was a very low volume shooter in college who was awesome in the mid range and ended up being a more reliable spacer. Obviously, we saw that this year. So I think that's another like point in his favor
Mhm.
of potentially improving as a shooter. Like the indicators aren't like incredible or anything, but they're really not bad at all.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about someone who I think he's still in the league and I think still has a chance, but not with his first team anymore. Similar kind of body type, though not to Dillon's extreme, which is David Roddy. Also a really sort of efficient scorer, in Colorado State in David's case. Very good rebounder and good passer, but again, not to Dillon's extreme. So do you think that the extremity of Dillon's talent has you more optimistic on him than you were on Roddy? Where were you on Roddy? How do you think the two compare?
I liked Roddy, honestly, for a lot of the reasons I like Dillon, but kind of as you said, I think Dillon is just like a lot better, especially offensively. Where Roddy, I thought of and kind of had optimism for him as like a mismatched Punisher, like utility offensive Swiss Army type. Whereas Dillon, I'm like, no, this guy could legit be a creator. I still have some faith for Roddy, like longish term,
Yeah,
but I
wouldn't
mean, I
write
think
him
like
off.
the playmaking gulf is obvious and just like the general feel gulf where like I don't think Roddy was like low feel or anything, but I don't think it's anywhere near what Dillon is. Um, and I think the defense could be similar. I'm curious about Dillon's defense just because of how insanely taxing his role is that he basically just like plays center. I think there are enough flashes of like really good awareness and stuff that he could be a good off-ball defender. His length is huge. He can be a disruptor. Um, Dillon has like he has like 10 blocks in his entire career, which is so strange for a guy with
Hmm.
that kind of win. Like even with his vertical limitations, he's not like the worst vertical athlete you've ever seen. Like he can dunk sometimes. Like he can get up and he's
I,
super long.
I think he's probably pretty committed to not leaving his feet so he
I
doesn't get
think
in
that's
foul
probably
trouble
true
and
as
he just
well.
stay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's just like, doesn't really go for that. So I wonder if that's something you can like tap into. I probably not just because I think rim protection is another skill that's very hard to teach. Um, but I don't know. Maybe it's like you're not gonna play like if you get 3 fouls enough to sit, your team's not gonna insta lose. So like you can try a little more. But
Yeah, I think when I really start to put rubber to road, I think that you'd want Dillon in a position where he can really leverage his strength, which would mean that you're not really playing him as a small four, you're playing him as like a really big two or a big three or
yeah,
something like
yeah, I
that.
agree.
And if you're doing that, then there is going to be a lot demanded of him in terms of defensive movement, just reload. And he has length to help him. He has strength to also help him. But
Right. Like
that
he
is,
has tools theoretically,
yeah,
like
it's, It's interesting. I think it is more likely, like in the same way that the slow-mo has more often than not just been a bench piece, but like a really good one for, he's still a good one for a very good team now. I think that is what you would hope Dillon becomes.
Yeah, I think that's
Um,
a great outcome if that's what happens.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, he was,
I think one more
yeah.
point in Dylan's favor is he is another like who fits the like the combine scrimmage dominator heuristic. Like I think like the first time I really like keyed into Dylan as a prospect was like last year's like G League combine scrimmage where I'm like, who is this guy who is kicking the shit out of everybody here?
Hmm.
Um, and I think notably like this combine scrimmage, he like didn't have as much usage, I think, but his defense to me was pretty solid. He was moving well on the ball, he was cutting guys off, and just nobody can move him with his strength. So a very small sample data point, but maybe like, okay, here's a setting where Dillon has to play a totally completely different role and he doesn't look horrible.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's also going to
just
be
another data
incumbent on
point.
him to like just in general play faster. Weaver played slow because it played to his preferred pace, and he's going to have
Right.
to find some way
Right.
to do that. But that's where you just bet on this incredible passing vision that he has and say that it's just going
Right.
to
It's like it's
start there and emanate out of
right. It's
that.
a bet on it's like he didn't like always not play fast because he can. It's because he didn't like to and didn't need to. Like
Right. Right.
he could do whatever he wanted playing his own way because he was so damn good. Like
Uh, yeah. So again, in this particular draft, you said in your video, which is on your YouTube channel that came out this week, that you would you would consider him top 20, or maybe you have him in the top 20 right around there. Is that accurate?
I have him top 20. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think he's worth that in this kind of draft that to me like doesn't really have a lot of interesting ceiling outcomes. Like I think a lot of the guys in this draft, especially later, are like, like they could be a fine role player. Like I don't really see any like interesting star upsides or useful rotation pathways. Whereas Dylan, I'm like, maybe you're not as like, okay, I know exactly what you're gonna be as like a Dalton Connect, but it's like
Hmm.
if everything goes well, it's like this is so much more interesting than those and
Yeah.
interesting and I think valuable and impactful. And I think Dylan, like I said, the fact that he's not going to go in the top 20, right? So wherever you get him, you're getting a value to me. And I think that's the case for like all of our favorite role players. Like I know we both like Mogbo and
Yes, we do.
um
It's
like
it's like
like
it's the potential where
Crawford
if
and types like that who I'm like these guys like maybe aren't as like envisionable as like shooter wings or traditional centers, but like there could be something really good here.
and
We just
if he hits, then you want to reinvest in that as a team. Like there chances are he's going to provide some level of value with all of that passing and rebounding that you want to get him on a second contract. And that's
right.
another easy way to measure the value or the success of a given, prospect or pick.
Right. He's a
Is he
guy who I
reinvestable, or is he going to bounce around?
He's a guy who
And
I think in a, assuming he goes to a team with a good coach and a good environment, can contribute right away, but also has like real potential to untap. And I think that's rare for older guys. I think it's something that most of them tend not to have, but I think Dylan and someone like Mogbo, maybe even, who I think of, they're obviously very different players, but I think of as like in a similar bucket with these like weird outlier talents.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I agree. Well, I've taken up enough of your time, Ben, but is there anything else you want to hit, or anyone else that has
um,
crossed your mind over the course of our discussion?
I think I'm probably good. Yeah, I think we covered all these guys in good enough depth. I mean, if you have anyone you want to get a last word in on or ask me anything about, here.
I don't really. I like your point about it being interesting is really good because all these guys are very, very interesting. And maybe
Yeah, that's
I'm at
kind
the
of what
point
I
of the
like getting
cycle
at
where
with
I'm
it.
just like I'm valuing guys who just like really are intrigue me.
Yeah.
But you will find on the other end, like Trevion Williams is an example of one. You will find like curios that just don't
Oh
fit
yeah.
in the NBA. I mean, that
Right.
is a real concern. It's just Dillon has enough of a face-up game. He has enough like
Yeah, it's like
he
enough of a projectable shot, enough
yeah,
projectable defense to where it's like I could imagine this going well.
right, right.
Like, can you imagine if he ends up in like Miami or something? Like, Like he would be like the bane of every Celtics fan's existence by next year. Like it would be so good.
Just brings a smile to my face if you were to end up in Miami. It'd be great.
Me too.
Yeah,
That would
like
be good.
Collier falls to them and they get him in the second round, and
God, that
let's
would be
go.
nuts.
Okay. Well,
Collier,
Ben,
man, he's
yeah,
gonna be annoying.
I don't know where his stock is right about now, but I hope it's now like horseshoeing back up. I don't
Hopefully,
know. Such an electric guy.
someone's getting a steal out of him.
Yeah, I
That I think
agree.
we agree on.
I agree. All right. Well, Ben, thank you so much. Your YouTube, it's BJPF YouTube as well, or Ben
No,
Pfeifer?
it's just my full name, Ben
Okay.
Pfeifer, Pfeifer. That's just like, but everything will be linked back to my Twitter. And like I said, so like if you can't find anything, it'll probably be somewhere linked in my Twitter. So
Okay. Sounds great. Thank you all very much for listening. This has been Chucking Darts. It's okay to be wrong about sports. Find your dartboard and start chucking. Thank you.